Lieutenant Sarah Chen's boots clicked against the polished concrete floor as she walked through the entrance of Naval Station Norfolk. The sound echoed in the vast hangar, seeming louder than it should have been in the early morning quiet. She carried her duffel bag over one shoulder and gripped her orders in her free hand, the paper slightly damp from her nervous perspiration. The smell hit her first, a mixture of jet fuel, salt air, and something she couldn't quite identify. Motor oil, maybe mixed with the metallic scent of aircraft and the underlying mustiness that seemed to permeate every military facility she had ever been in. It was familiar and foreign at the same time, like a song she had heard before, but couldn't quite remember the words to. Sarah had been dreaming of this moment for years. Ever since she was 12 years old and watched her father return from his deployment in the Persian Gulf, she had known she wanted to serve. She wanted to be part of something bigger than herself, something that mattered. She had worked harder than anyone else in her class at the Naval Academy, graduated in the top 5%, and earned her commission with honors. She had trained for months for this assignment, studying every manual, memorizing every procedure, preparing for every possible scenario she might face. But as she looked around the hangar at the massive aircraft and the groups of personnel clustered around various workstations, she felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The same feeling she had experienced on her first day at the academy, when she realized she was one of only 17 women in a class of over 1,000 midshipmen. The same feeling she had when she walked into her first engineering class and saw 43 male faces turn to stare at her. The same feeling she had learned to push down and ignore because there was no other choice. A group of mechanics near one of the aircraft stopped their conversation as she passed. She could feel their eyes following her, could hear the subtle shift in their voices as they resumed talking. She kept her head up and her stride confident, even though her heart was pounding against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. "You lost, sweetheart." The voice came from behind her, casual and mocking. Sarah turned to see a petty officer with grease-stained coveralls and a smirk that made her skin crawl. He was flanked by two other men, both wearing the same expression of amused condescension. "No," Sarah replied evenly, holding up her orders. "I'm reporting for duty. Lieutenant Chun, assigned to Squadron VF 142. The petty officer's smirk widened. "VF 142? The Ghost Riders?" He looked at his companions and shook his head. "Lady, I think someone made a mistake. The Ghost Riders don't take passengers. They're a combat squadron." "I'm not a passenger," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite the anger building in her chest. "I'm a pilot." The three men burst into laughter, the sound harsh and grating in the vast space of the hangar. Other personnel began to take notice, their conversations dying as they turned to see what was happening. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had dealt with this before. She would deal with it again. "A pilot," one of the other men repeated, as if the word was the funniest thing he had ever heard. "What do you fly, sweetheart?" "Paper airplanes. I fly F/18 Super Hornets," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "And I graduated at the top of my flight training class." The laughter died abruptly, replaced by skeptical silence. The petty officer looked her up and down, his expression shifting from amusement to something closer to hostility. "Top of your class, huh? What class was that?" "Remedial flight school for the special needs kids." Sarah felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself, to show these men exactly what she was capable of. But she had learned the hard way that rising to the bait would only make things worse. Instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "If you could direct me to the squadron ready room, I'd appreciate it," she said, her voice polite but firm. "I need to check in with my commanding officer." The petty officer jerked his thumb toward the far end of the hangar. "Down that corridor, take a left at the first junction, then follow the smell of testosterone and disappointment. You can't miss it." Sarah nodded curtly and walked away, her back straight and her head high. Behind her, She could hear the men resuming their conversation, their voices filled with mockery and disbelief. She caught fragments of their words: diversity hire, political correctness, disaster waiting to happen. But she forced herself not to react. She had heard it all before. The corridor was dimmer than the hangar, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. Her footsteps seemed even louder here, echoing off the bare walls like gunshots. She passed office doors and storage rooms, each one marked with official Navy designations that meant nothing to her yet, but soon would become as familiar as her own name. The ready room was exactly where the petty officer had said it would be, though she followed the sound of voices rather than any smell. The door was open, and she could see inside to a room filled with chairs arranged in rows facing a large screen at the front. Maps and charts covered the walls, along with photographs of aircraft and what she assumed were previous squadron members. It looked like every ready room she had ever seen in movies or magazines, except this one was real, and she was actually standing in the doorway. Inside, a dozen men in flight suits were clustered around a table, their conversation animated and loud. Sarah recognized the easy camaraderie that existed between people who trusted each other with their lives, the kind of bond that was forged in training and tested in combat. She wanted to be part of that brotherhood more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. She knocked on the door frame to announce her presence. The conversation stopped immediately, and 12 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. She could feel their assessment, their judgment, their immediate dismissal of her as a serious threat or even a serious person. "Can we help you?" The voice belonged to a tall man with dark hair and captain's bars on his collar. His tone was polite, but cool, the kind of politeness that was really just barely concealed irritation. "Captain Martinez?" Sarah stepped into the room and came to attention. "Lieutenant Sarah Chun, reporting for duty, sir. I've been assigned to your squadron." Captain Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked down at a clipboard on the table, flipped through several pages, and then looked back at her. "Lieutenant Chun," he said slowly, as if he was trying to remember where he had heard the name before. "Yes, I have your orders here. You're our new pilot." The way he said the word pilot made it clear that he had his doubts about her qualifications. Sarah had expected this. She had been preparing for this conversation for months, rehearsing her responses to every possible challenge or question. She was ready. "Yes, sir. I'm qualified in F/A-18 Super Hornets, and I'm looking forward to joining the squadron." Captain Martinez nodded slowly. "I'm sure you are." He turned to the other men in the room. "Gentlemen, this is Lieutenant Chun. She'll be joining us for the foreseeable future." The introduction was met with barely concealed snickers and eye rolls. Sarah could feel their skepticism like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She had known it would be like this. She had prepared herself for exactly this reaction. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two very different things. "Why don't you find yourself a seat?" Captain Martinez continued, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the room. "We were just reviewing today's training schedule." Sarah walked to an empty chair in the back row, acutely aware of every eye following her movement. She sat down and pulled out a notebook, determined to prove that she belonged here through her professionalism and attention to detail. If they wanted to judge her, she would give them nothing to criticize. Captain Martinez resumed the briefing, discussing weather conditions, training objectives, and safety protocols. Sarah listened intently, taking notes and tried to memorize every detail. This was her chance to learn, to prove herself, to show that she was serious about being here. But as the briefing continued, she began to notice something disturbing. The training schedule that Captain Martinez was outlining didn't include her. Flight assignments, formation practice, weapons training. Her name wasn't mentioned in connection with any of it. She was sitting in a room full of pilots discussing pilot training, but apparently she wasn't expected to participate. She raised her hand tentatively. "Excuse me, sir." Captain Martinez paused and looked at her with the expression of someone who had just been interrupted by an unexpected and unwelcome noise. Yes, Lieutenant. I don't see my name on any of the training assignments. Where am I scheduled to fly? The room fell silent again. Sarah could feel the tension ratcheting up another notch, could sense the barely suppressed amusement from the other pilots. Captain Martinez looked down at his clipboard again, though Sarah was certain he already knew what was written there. Well, Lieutenant, he said finally, we've decided to start you off with some administrative duties. Paperwork, inventory management, that sort of thing. Get you familiar with how we operate before we put you in the air. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Administrative duties? Sir, I'm a qualified pilot. I didn't come here to push papers. I understand your eagerness, Captain Martinez replied, his tone becoming noticeably cooler. But we have procedures here. Standards. We can't just put someone in a multi-million-dollar aircraft without being absolutely certain they're ready for it. I am ready for it, Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice level. I've completed all the required training. I have over 200 hours of flight time. My records speak for themselves. One of the other pilots, a lieutenant commander with sandy hair and a crooked smile, leaned back in his chair. Records can be misleading, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Sometimes people get pushed through training for reasons that have nothing to do with their actual abilities. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt anger flare hot in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but Captain Martinez cut her off. That's enough discussion for now, he said firmly. Lieutenant Chun, report to Lieutenant Morrison in the admin office. He'll get you set up with your initial assignments. Gentlemen, let's continue with the briefing. Sarah sat frozen for a moment, her mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be treated like any other pilot, judged on her abilities and her performance, not sidelined before she even had a chance to prove herself. But she also knew that arguing further would only make things worse. She had to pick her battles carefully. She stood up slowly, gathered her things, and walked toward the door. Behind her, she could hear the briefing resume, the voices of the other pilots discussing the very training exercises she should have been participating in. As she reached the doorway, she heard one of them mutter something about quota fillers and political correctness run amok. The corridor seemed longer on the way back, each step feeling like a defeat. She had known this assignment would be challenging. She had known she would face skepticism and discrimination. But she had believed that her qualifications would speak for themselves, that eventually her performance would silence the doubters. Now she was beginning to realize that it might not be that simple. These men had already made up their minds about her before she had even walked through the door. They had decided she was inferior, unqualified, a liability. And they were going to do everything in their power to make sure she never got the chance to prove them wrong. But Sarah Chen had not come this far to give up at the first sign of resistance. She had faced down professors who told her she wasn't smart enough for engineering. She had endured instructors who seemed determined to wash her out of flight training. She had survived 4 years at an academy where she was constantly reminded that she didn't belong. She would survive this too. And eventually, somehow, she would find a way to make them see that they were wrong about her. She had to, because the alternative, giving up, going home, admitting defeat, was simply not an option. The administrative office was a small, cluttered space filled with filing cabinets and outdated computer equipment. Lieutenant Morrison was a thin man with glasses who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. He handed her a stack of forms and manuals without making eye contact. Supply inventory, he mumbled, pointing to a corner desk. Everything needs to be logged and cross-referenced. Should keep you busy for a while. Sarah took the papers and sat down at the desk, staring at the endless columns of part numbers and quantities. This wasn't what she had trained for. This wasn't what she had sacrificed for. This wasn't the dream she had been chasing since she was 12 years old. But it was where she was now. And somehow, she had to find a way to turn this setback into an opportunity. Because Lieutenant Sarah Chun was not the kind of person who accepted defeat easily. And she had a feeling that this was only the beginning of her fight. 3 weeks into her assignment at Naval Station Norfolk, Sarah Chun had become intimately familiar with every supply closet, every piece of outdated equipment, and every form that needed to be filed in triplicate. Her desk in the administrative office had become her prison, surrounded by towers of paperwork that seemed to reproduce themselves overnight. Each morning, she watched through the window as the other pilots walked past in their flight suits, heading to the flight line for another day of training. She knew their schedules by heart now, had memorized the sound of the F divided by -18s taking off and landing, could tell from the engine noise whether they were practicing formation flying or weapons training. The sound was both beautiful and torturous, a constant reminder of what she was being denied. Lieutenant Morrison had proven to be exactly what she had expected, a bureaucrat who seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding new administrative tasks for her to complete. Every time she finished one project, he would appear with another stack of forms, another inventory to conduct, another meaningless report to compile. These maintenance logs need to be digitized, he would say, dropping a box of papers on her desk. The computer system is antiquated, but orders are orders. Sarah would nod and add the task to her growing list, maintaining her professional demeanor even as frustration ate away at her from the inside. She had complained to Captain Martinez twice about her assignment, formally requesting to be included in flight training. Both times, she had been told that her administrative duties were essential to squadron operations and that flight assignments would be considered when appropriate. When appropriate, the words had become a cruel joke. But Sarah had not survived this long by waiting for other people to decide when she was worthy of opportunity. If the official channels were blocked, she would find another way. She began staying late in the office, ostensibly to catch up on her assigned work, but actually to study the squadron's operations more closely. She memorized maintenance schedules, learned which aircraft were available for training flights, and began to understand the complex logistics that kept the squadron operational. She studied weather patterns, flight regulations, and safety protocols. If she couldn't fly, she would at least make sure she was prepared when the opportunity finally came. The breakthrough came by accident, as many breakthroughs do. It was a Thursday evening, and Sarah was alone in the administrative office working on yet another supply inventory. The hangar was mostly empty except for the overnight maintenance crew, and the building had that hollow, echoing quality that large spaces get when there are no people around to absorb the sound. She was finishing up the last page of motor oil specifications when she heard voices coming from the corridor. 2 men were walking past, their conversation carrying clearly in the quiet air. "Told you she wouldn't last a month," one of them was saying. Sarah recognized the voice as belonging to Commander Stevens, the squadron's executive officer. "Desk work isn't exactly what she signed up for." "Martinez knows what he's doing," the other voice replied. Sarah didn't recognize this one, but the tone was authoritative. "Can't have passengers in combat aircraft. Too much liability. Still seems like a waste," Commander Stevens continued. Her test scores were actually pretty impressive, and her flight instructor from Pensacola said she was one of the best students he'd ever had. Sarah's pen stopped moving across the page. Her flight instructor had said that about her. She had never heard anything but criticism from the chain of command since arriving at Norfolk. "Scores don't mean anything when the bullets start flying," the unknown voice replied. "Combat aviation isn't about being the best in the classroom. It's about split-second decisions under pressure. Women just don't have the right instincts for that kind of work." Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she forced herself to remain still and keep listening. "Maybe," Commander Stevens said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "But we might not have a choice much longer. Washington's been asking questions about our pilot assignments. Something about equal opportunity and utilization of qualified personnel." "Let them ask," the other voice said dismissively. "As long as she's technically assigned to the squadron, we're following the letter of the law. What she actually does day to day is an operational decision." Their voices faded as they moved away down the corridor, but Sarah remained frozen at her desk, processing what she had just heard. Her test scores were impressive. Her flight instructor had recommended her. The only thing keeping her on the ground was prejudice and politics. But, more importantly, Washington was asking questions. Someone, somewhere, was paying attention to how she was being treated. That meant there might be hope after all. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of heading directly to the administrative office as she had been doing for the past 3 weeks, she took a detour through the hangar. She wanted to see the aircraft up close, to remind herself why she was fighting so hard to be here. The F/A 18 Super Hornets were even more impressive than she had imagined. Sleek and deadly, they squatted on the hangar floor like predatory birds waiting to take flight. She walked slowly around one of them, admiring the clean lines and purposeful design. Every surface had been shaped for maximum efficiency, every component designed to give the pilot every possible advantage in combat. She was so absorbed in her examination of the aircraft that she didn't notice the approach of Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez until he spoke. "Beautiful machines, aren't they?" Sarah turned, expecting to see the same hostility she had encountered from most of the squadron personnel. Instead, she found herself facing a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes and calloused hands stained with hydraulic fluid. "Yes, sir," she replied cautiously. "They really are." Chief Rodriguez walked around to join her, running his hand along the aircraft's wing with the familiarity of someone who had spent years working on these machines. "Been maintaining these birds for 15 years, he said. "Never get tired of looking at them. Each one has its own personality, its own quirks. You get to know them like people." Sarah nodded, not sure where this conversation was heading, but grateful for the first friendly interaction she had experienced since arriving at the base. "You're Lieutenant Shun, aren't you?" Chief Rodriguez continued. "The new pilot." "Allegedly," Sarah replied, then immediately regretted the bitterness in her voice. She was supposed to be professional at all times, regardless of how she felt about her situation. Chief Rodriguez chuckled. "Allegedly? That's about right." He looked at her seriously. "You know, I've seen your file. Impressive flight hours for someone your age. Top marks in weapons training. Your instructor at Pensacola sent a personal letter recommending you for this assignment." Sarah felt a surge of surprise and gratitude. He did. Said you had the best natural flying instincts he'd seen in 10 years of instruction. Said you were calm under pressure and had excellent situational awareness. Chief Rodriguez paused. "Of course, none of that matters much if you never get in the cockpit." Sarah looked around the hangar, making sure they weren't being overheard. "Chief, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Do you think they'll ever actually let me fly? Or is this all just for show, keeping me busy until I get tired of it and transfer out?" Chief Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "Lieutenant, I've been in this Navy for 22 years. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good. I've seen officers who deserve chances they never got, and I've seen others get opportunities they didn't earn." He turned to face her directly. "But I've also seen that talent has a way of rising to the surface, eventually. The good ones always find a way to prove themselves, even when the system is working against them." "How?" Sarah asked. "How do the good ones prove themselves when they're not allowed to show what they can do?" Chief Rodriguez smiled. "They find opportunities that other people miss. They make themselves indispensable in ways that can't be ignored. They learn everything there is to know about their job, and then they learn everyone else's job too. And when the moment comes, and it always comes, they're ready." Sarah thought about his words as she walked to the administrative office. Make herself indispensable. Learn everyone else's job. Be ready when the moment came. That afternoon, she approached Lieutenant Morrison with a proposal. "Sir, I've been thinking about ways to improve efficiency in our supply management," she said, trying to sound as professional and bureaucratic as possible. "I've noticed some inconsistencies in our maintenance scheduling that might be costing us flight hours." Lieutenant Morrison looked up from his computer with the expression of someone who had just been asked to solve advanced calculus. "Inconsistencies?" "Yes, sir. Cross-referencing the maintenance logs with the flight schedules, I've identified several instances where aircraft were grounded for routine maintenance during periods when they were needed for training missions. With better coordination, we could probably increase our operational readiness by 10 to 15%. Sarah had spent the previous evening creating the analysis, working from memory and the documents she had access to in the administrative office. It was real work, based on real data, but it also served another purpose. It would require her to have direct access to flight operations. Lieutenant Morrison stared at her proposal for several minutes, clearly out of his depth. This is very detailed work, Lieutenant. Thank you, sir. I believe efficient logistics are essential to mission success. I'll need to run this by Captain Martinez, he said finally. This kind of analysis, it would require coordination with the maintenance department and the flight operations office. Of course, sir. I'm prepared to work with whatever departments are necessary to improve our operational efficiency. That evening, Sarah received a call from Captain Martinez asking her to report to his office first thing in the morning. She spent the night alternating between excitement and terror, wondering if her gambit had worked or if she had just made a terrible mistake. Captain Martinez's office was spartanly decorated, with only a few photographs and certificates on the walls. He gestured for her to sit across from his desk, then spent several minutes reviewing her proposal without speaking. Sarah forced herself to remain calm and professional, even though her heart was racing. This is interesting work, Lieutenant, he said finally. Very thorough, very detailed. Thank you, sir. The question is, how did you gain access to the information you needed to complete this analysis? Some of these maintenance records are classified. Sarah had anticipated this question. Sir, all the information I used is contained in documents that were provided to me for administrative filing. I simply cross-referenced data that was already in my possession. Captain Martinez raised an eyebrow. You memorized flight schedules and maintenance logs while filing paperwork. Yes, sir. I believe in understanding all aspects of squadron operations. Captain Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Lieutenant Shun, are you trying to tell me that you accidentally stumbled across operational inefficiencies while performing routine administrative duties? Sarah met his gaze steadily. No, sir. I'm telling you that I actively looked for ways to contribute to squadron effectiveness, using whatever resources were available to me. For the first time since she had arrived at Norfolk, Captain Martinez smiled. It wasn't a warm smile exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the smile of someone who had just realized they might have underestimated their opponent. Well played, Lieutenant. Well played. He closed a folder containing her analysis. Your recommendations have merit. I'm going to authorize you to work directly with Chief Rodriguez and the maintenance department to implement these efficiency improvements. Sarah felt a surge of triumph, but she kept her voice level. Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't. And, Lieutenant. Captain Martinez's expression grew serious. This is a trial run. You'll be working closely with flight operations, which means you'll have access to information that could be critical to squadron safety. I'm trusting you with that responsibility. Don't make me regret it. Understood, sir. As Sarah walked back to the administrative office, she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Norfolk. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was a foothold, a chance to prove herself, a way to get closer to the aircraft and the pilots who flew them. Chief Rodriguez was waiting for her when she arrived at the maintenance bay that afternoon. Heard you stirred up some attention upstairs, he said with a grin. Martinez actually looked impressed, which is more than most people manage their first month here. It's a start, Sarah replied. Now I need to make sure I don't screw it up. You won't, Chief Rodriguez said confidently. I can tell. You've got that look. What look? The same look every good pilot has. Like you're already flying, even when your feet are on the ground. For the first time in 3 weeks, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she might actually get her chance to prove that Chief Rodriguez was right. 2 months into her assignment, Sarah had transformed from an unwanted administrative burden into someone the squadron couldn't easily ignore. Her efficiency improvements had saved the squadron over 40 flight hours in the first month alone, and her detailed maintenance tracking system had caught 3 potentially serious mechanical issues before they could become flight safety problems. Chief Rodriguez had become her unofficial mentor and advocate, teaching her the subtle art of aircraft maintenance and the even more subtle art of military politics. Under his guidance, she had learned to read the hangar like a book, which aircraft were truly ready for flight, which pilots were struggling with their training, and which missions were considered routine versus those that carried real importance. The key, Chief Rodriguez told her one afternoon as they inspected a hydraulic system, is to become the person they can't do without. Don't just do your job well. Do everyone's job better than they do it themselves. Sarah took his advice to heart. She memorized every pilot's preferences and quirks, learned which aircraft each pilot preferred and why, and began to anticipate maintenance needs before they became problems. She created detailed briefing materials for complex missions, organized equipment inventories with military precision, and somehow managed to make the administrative side of the squadron run more smoothly than it ever had before. But despite her growing importance to squadron operations, she still hadn't been allowed near a cockpit. The closest she came was during pre-flight inspections, where she would walk around the aircraft with the pilots and maintenance crews, checking for any issues that might affect the mission. She had memorized every switch, every gauge, every warning light in the F/A-18 cockpit, but she was always just an observer, never a participant. The other pilots had stopped actively mocking her, but their attitude remained one of polite dismissal. She was useful, they acknowledged, but she wasn't one of them. She was support personnel who happened to hold a pilot's commission, nothing more. That changed on a gray Tuesday morning in November when an emergency call came and that would test everyone's assumptions about what Lieutenant Sarah Chun was capable of. Sarah was in the maintenance bay working on a fuel consumption analysis when the klaxon began wailing throughout the hangar. The sound was sharp and urgent, designed to cut through any other noise and demand immediate attention. Within seconds, the orderly bustle of normal maintenance work transformed into controlled chaos as personnel rushed to their emergency stations. "What's happening?" Sarah asked Chief Rodriguez, who was already moving toward the communication center. "Search and rescue," he replied tersely. "Someone's in trouble." Sarah followed him to the center of the hangar, where a crowd was gathering around Captain Martinez as he briefed the squadron on the developing situation. His voice was calm, but urgent, carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with emergencies many times before. "Civilian aircraft, twin-engine Cessna, lost contact with air traffic control approximately 40 minutes ago," he was saying. "Last known position was about 60 miles northeast of here, over open water. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Low ceiling, high winds, visibility dropping fast." Lieutenant Commander Williams, the squadron's most experienced pilot, stepped forward. "What's our response, sir?" "We're launching a full search pattern," Captain Martinez replied. "For aircraft, standard SAR configuration. Williams, you'll take the lead. Peterson, Jackson, and Reeves will fly wing. Weather window is closing fast, so we need to get airborne in 20 minutes." The pilots began moving toward their aircraft, their movements quick and efficient. Sarah watched them go, feeling the familiar mixture of admiration and frustration that came with being relegated to the sidelines during the moments that mattered most. But as the pilots reached their aircraft, Chief Rodriguez appeared at Captain Martinez's shoulder, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a problem," he said quietly. "Aircraft 304 has a hydraulic leak. Major malfunction in the primary flight control system. She's grounded until we can replace the entire unit." Captain Martinez's jaw tightened. "How long for the repair?" 6 hours minimum. Maybe 8 if we run into complications." "Damn." Captain Martinez looked around the hangar, his eyes scanning the available aircraft. "What about the backup birds?" "2 are down for scheduled maintenance. The third has an avionics problem that we haven't been able to isolate." Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she realized what this meant. The squadron was 1 aircraft short for a time-sensitive search and rescue mission. Someone's life might depend on getting that 4th aircraft in the air, and they didn't have a pilot to fly it. Except they did. Captain Martinez was clearly thinking the same thing. His eyes found Sarah in the crowd, and for a moment, she saw him weighing his options. She could practically read his thoughts, the political complications of putting her in the air for the first time during an emergency mission, The potential consequences if something went wrong, the criticism he would face from his superiors regardless of the outcome. But she could also see him doing the math. 4 aircraft would be more effective than 3. Every minute they delayed reduced the chances of finding survivors. And despite his reservations about her qualifications, he had to acknowledge that she was, technically, a qualified pilot. "Lieutenant Chun," he called out, his voice carrying across the hangar. Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Yes, sir." Captain Martinez studied her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Around them, the hangar had gone quiet as everyone realized what was happening. "You're current on your flight qualifications?" "Yes, sir. I completed my recurrency training 6 weeks ago." "SCR procedures?" "I'm familiar with standard search patterns and rescue protocols, sir." Another pause. Sarah could feel the weight of a dozen hostile stares, could sense the disbelief and disapproval radiating from the other pilots. This was not how anyone had expected her first flight to happen. "Aircraft 308 is configured for search and rescue," Captain Martinez said finally. "Standard loadout, full fuel. Weather's marginal and getting worse. Visibility is going to be limited, and you'll be flying over open water in rough conditions." "I understand, sir. This isn't a training mission, Lieutenant. This is a real-world emergency situation. People's lives may depend on your performance up there. Are you ready for that responsibility?" Sarah looked around the hangar at the faces surrounding her. Some showed skepticism, others outright hostility. A few, like Chief Rodriguez, showed encouragement and support. But mostly what she saw was doubt about her abilities, her judgment, her right to be there at all. She thought about all the hours she had spent studying, all the training she had endured, all the obstacles she had overcome to get to this moment. She thought about the unknown civilians who might be floating in life rafts somewhere over the gray Atlantic, counting on the Navy to find them before the weather got worse. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who had watched her father return from deployment and decided she wanted to serve her country too. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm ready." Captain Martinez nodded once. "Chief Rodriguez, get Lieutenant Chen's aircraft prepped for immediate launch. Full emergency configuration." He turned to the other pilots. "Williams, you'll maintain flight lead. Lieutenant Chun will fly the number 4 position. Standard SAR pattern, radio discipline, and for God's sake, everybody comes home safe." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Sarah grabbed her flight gear from her locker, checked and double-checked every piece of equipment, and ran through her pre-flight checklist with obsessive attention to detail. Chief Rodriguez and his maintenance crew swarmed over aircraft 308, ensuring that every system was functioning perfectly. "First combat mission?" Chief Rodriguez asked as he helped her with her harness. "First mission, period," Sarah replied. "Unless you count training flights. This bird will take care of you," he said, patting the side of the cockpit. "She's been flying search and rescue for 8 years. Never let anyone down yet." Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began her startup procedures. The familiar routine of switches and checks helped calm her nerves, grounding her in the technical precision that had carried her through flight training. Around her, the F/A-18 systems came alive with soft electronic sounds and the gentle hum of spinning turbines. Through her headset, she could hear the other pilots completing their own preparations, their voices professional and calm despite the urgency of the mission. She forced herself to match their tone when she called in her readiness status. "Ghost Rider 4, ready for taxi." "Ghost Rider flight, this is Tower," came the controller's voice. "You're cleared for immediate taxi to runway 03. Weather is deteriorating rapidly. Current conditions are ceiling at 800 feet, visibility 3 miles, and decreasing, winds gusting to 25 knots. The 4 aircraft taxied to the runway in formation, their engines adding a steady roar to the sound of wind and rain that was beginning to pelt the canopy. Sarah could see the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, a wall of gray that promised worse weather to come. Remember, Lieutenant Commander Williams's voice came over the radio. We're looking for a white twin-engine Cessna, probably in the water by now. Standard search pattern, 1 mile spacing. Keep your eyes open and your altitude consistent. Weather's going to make this challenging, so stay sharp. Ghost Rider flight, you're cleared for takeoff. Wind 040 at 20 gusting to 30. Good luck out there. The runway stretched out ahead of them, rain slicked and disappearing into the gray distance. Sarah felt her breathing steady as the familiar routine of takeoff procedures took over. This was what she had trained for. This was what she was meant to do. Ghost Rider 4, ready for takeoff. Ghost Rider flight, rolling now. The acceleration pressed Sarah back in her seat as the F/18's engines spun up to full power. The runway disappeared beneath her as the aircraft lifted into the gray November sky, climbing steadily toward the storm clouds that hung over the Atlantic Ocean. For the first time since arriving at Naval Station Norfolk, Lieutenant Sarah Chun was exactly where she belonged. As the coastline fell away beneath them, and they headed out over the dark waters of the Atlantic, Sarah felt a calm settle over her that she hadn't experienced in months. The cockpit felt natural, like an extension of her own body. The aircraft responded to her touch with precision and grace. Every control input translated instantly into smooth, purposeful movement. Ghost Rider flight, this is Norfolk Control, the radio crackled. Search area is 15 miles northeast of your current position. Coast Guard has drift calculations based on last known position and current conditions. Survivors could be anywhere in a 20 square mile area. 20 square miles of gray ocean with visibility dropping and weather conditions worsening by the minute. It would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was moving and the needle might already be underwater. But as Sarah settled into the rhythm of the search pattern, she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Norfolk. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The real test was just beginning. The search area looked like a gray wasteland from 2,000 feet. Waves rolled endlessly in all directions, their white caps disappearing and reappearing in the growing darkness of the storm. Sarah flew her assigned pattern with mechanical precision, her eyes scanning the water below while fighting the turbulence that threatened to throw her aircraft around like a toy. Ghost Rider flight, this is lead. Lieutenant Commander Williams's voice came through her headset, steady despite the challenging conditions. Visibility is dropping faster than forecast. We got maybe 30 minutes before this becomes impossible. 30 minutes to find survivors in 20 square miles of rough ocean. Sarah did the math automatically. Even with 4 aircraft, they could only cover a fraction of the search area in that time. Someone would have to get lucky, or the people they were looking for would die. She had been flying the search pattern for 15 minutes when she noticed something that made her adjust her flight path slightly. The other pilots were maintaining rigid adherence to their assigned grid squares, flying precise lines back and forth across their designated areas. It was exactly what they had been trained to do, exactly what the manual called for. But Sarah had spent 2 months studying every piece of data that came through the squadron, including weather reports and ocean current analyses. She had memorized drift patterns and survival statistics not because she had to, but because she believed information was power. And right now, that information was telling her something the other pilots might have missed. The Coast Guard's drift calculations were based on normal weather conditions, but the storm had been building strength for the past 6 hours. The winds had shifted from southeast to northeast, which would have pushed any debris or survivors further west than the original estimate suggested. Sarah made a decision that would either save lives or end her career. Ghost Rider lead, this is 4, she called over the radio. Go ahead, 4. Requesting permission to expand my search pattern to grid square Delta 7. Current drift analysis suggests survivors may have moved further west than originally calculated. There was a pause. Sarah could imagine Lieutenant Commander Williams checking his charts, trying to understand why the newest pilot in the squadron was requesting to deviate from the standard search protocol. 4. Maintain assigned pattern. We need complete coverage of the primary search area first. Sarah felt frustration well up in her chest, but she forced her voice to remain professional. Lead, wind patterns have shifted significantly since the original drift calculations. I believe there's a high probability that survivors have moved outside the primary search area. 4. Maintain assigned pattern. That's an order. Sarah stared down at the empty water below her assigned grid square. Every instinct she had, every piece of analysis she had done, told her that they were looking in the wrong place. But she was the least experienced pilot on the mission, flying her first operational flight, and she had just been given a direct order by the flight leader. She maintained her pattern for another 5 minutes, flying precise lines over water that grew emptier and more forbidding with each pass. The weather was getting worse, and she could see that visibility was dropping even faster than Williams had predicted. Soon, they would have to abandon the search and return to base, leaving whoever was out there to face the storm alone. Then she saw it, a flash of orange, barely visible through the rain and spray, floating in the water 2 miles west of her assigned search area. It was there for just a moment before a wave covered it, but Sarah was certain of what she had seen. Ghost Rider lead, this is 4. I have possible survivors in the water, bearing 270 from my current position, approximately 2 miles. 4. You're outside your assigned search area. Confirm your position. Sarah checked her navigation display. She was indeed outside her assigned grid square, having drifted west while scanning the water below. But she was also certain of what she had seen. Lead, I have visual contact with what appears to be a life raft. Orange in color, approximately 4 people visible. Grid square Delta 7, about 2 miles west of the primary search boundary. 4. Return to your assigned area immediately. You're breaking formation. Sarah felt time slowing down as she faced the most important decision of her career. She could follow orders, return to her assigned search area, and maintain her position in the formation. It was the safe choice, the one that would keep her out of trouble with her commanding officers, where she could trust her training, her instincts, and her analysis, and try to save the lives of the people she believed were floating in that life raft. Lead, this is 4. I'm going to investigate the contact. I'll maintain radio communication and rejoin formation as soon as possible. 4. You are ordered to return to formation immediately. Do not break off on an unauthorized rescue attempt. Sarah turned off her radio. She banked her aircraft sharply to the west, descending through the gray clouds toward the position where she had seen the orange flash. The turbulence was severe at this altitude, and she had to fight to keep the F/18 stable as she searched the churning water below. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had been wrong. The water looked empty, just endless gray waves disappearing into the rain and mist. She began to doubt herself, began to wonder if she had just thrown away her career for a hallucination brought on by stress and desperation. Then she saw them. For people in bright orange life jackets, clinging to an inflatable raft that was being tossed around by the waves like a cork. They were barely staying together, and Sarah could see that their raft was taking on water. In these conditions, they had maybe minutes before the raft would be swamped completely. She keyed her radio back on. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ghost Rider 4. I have 4 survivors in the water at Grid Square Delta 7. Immediate assistance required. Survivors are in imminent danger. Ghost Rider 4, this is Lead. Confirm your position and status. Lead, I have 4 survivors in life jackets, clinging to a partially submerged raft. They're approximately 1 mile from shore, but the raft is failing. They need immediate rescue. Sarah could hear the change in Lieutenant Commander Williams's voice when he realized she had actually found them. 4. Maintain visual contact with survivors. I'm calling in Coast Guard rescue. What's the condition of the survivors? Sarah circled lower, fighting the turbulence as she tried to get a better look at the people in the water. Lead, survivors appear conscious but in distress. Raft is taking on water rapidly. Estimate they have less than 10 minutes before complete submersion. Coast Guard rescue is 20 minutes out, Williams replied. 4. can you maintain visual contact until rescue arrives? Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and did some quick calculations. 20 minutes of loitering plus flight time back to base would put her right at minimum fuel reserves. It would be cutting it close, but it was doable. Affirmative, lead. I can maintain contact for 20 minutes. What happened next would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. One of the survivors, a man in his 50s wearing a blue jacket, suddenly disappeared beneath the waves. Sarah watched in horror as the other 3 people in the raft frantically reached into the water, trying to pull him back to the surface. But the waves were too strong, and the man was too exhausted to help himself. Lead, this is 4. One survivor has gone under. The others are trying to reach him, but they're not going to make it. 4. Maintain your position. Coast Guard is 15 minutes out. Sarah stared down at the scene below her. The 3 remaining survivors were still trying to reach their companion, but she could see that they were losing the battle. The man would drown before the Coast Guard arrived, and there was nothing anyone could do about it from 2,000 feet up. Except there was. Sarah had trained for water survival as part of her military education. She knew the risks and the procedures for emergency water landings. She also knew that attempting to land in F/18 in rough seas was extremely dangerous and almost certainly against every regulation in the book. But she also knew that a man was drowning below her, and she was the only person in position to help him. Lead, this is 4. I'm going down. 4. Repeat your last transmission. I'm going down to attempt water rescue. The survivor won't last until Coast Guard arrival. 4. You're not authorized for water landing. Return to altitude immediately. Sarah was already beginning her descent, configuring her aircraft for emergency water landing. The F/18 had ejection seats, which meant she could bail out if the landing went badly. But it also meant she would have to get very close to the water to have any chance of helping the survivors. For this is lead. You are ordered to maintain altitude. Do not attempt water landing. Sarah switched off her radio again and continued her descent. The water rushed up toward her as she fought to control the aircraft in the turbulent air near the surface. This was the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted, and she was doing it against direct orders from her flight leader. But the alternative was watching someone die when she might have been able to save them. At 50 feet above the water, Sarah ejected from her aircraft. The ejection seat fired her clear of the F/18 just seconds before it hit the water with tremendous force, disintegrating in a shower of metal and foam. The impact with the water was brutal, even with her survival gear, but Sarah managed to inflate her emergency raft and began swimming toward the survivors. The man who had gone under was floating face down about 20 yards from the others, unconscious but still breathing. Sarah reached him first, turned him over, and began towing him back toward his companions. The waves were enormous, and several times she thought they would all be swept under, but somehow she managed to get everyone together in her emergency raft. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived 8 minutes later to find 5 people clinging to a bright yellow emergency raft, all of them alive. Sarah had saved 4 lives, destroyed a $30 million aircraft, and violated multiple direct orders in the process. As the helicopter lifted them to safety, she had no idea whether she would be court-martialed or given a medal. But she did know that she had done the right thing. And for the first time since arriving at Norfolk, she felt like she had finally proven that she belonged there. The real question was whether anyone else would see it that way. The hearing room at Naval Station Norfolk was exactly as cold and intimidating as Sarah had expected it to be. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the long table where 5 senior officers sat in judgment of her actions. Captain Martinez was there, his expression unreadable. Commander Stevens sat beside him, looking like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. The other 3 officers were strangers to Sarah, but their rank insignia and stern expressions made it clear that her career was in their hands. At the head of the table sat Admiral Elizabeth Hawthorne, a woman whose reputation preceded her throughout the entire Atlantic Fleet. She was known for her brilliant tactical mind, her unwavering integrity, and her absolute intolerance for officers who couldn't follow orders. The fact that she had come personally to Norfolk for this hearing told Sarah everything she needed to know about how seriously her actions were being taken. Sarah sat alone at a small table facing the panel, still wearing the base hospital scrubs because her flight suit had been destroyed in the crash 3 days earlier. Her left arm was in a sling from the ejection, and she had a spectacular collection of bruises from her impact with the water, but she was alive. More importantly, so were the 4 civilians she had pulled from the Atlantic Ocean. The charges were read in the flat, emotionless tone that military legal proceedings were famous for. Disobeying direct orders, reckless endangerment of government property, unauthorized deviation from assigned mission parameters, destruction of military aircraft valued at $32 million. Each charge felt like a physical blow. Sarah had known this was coming, had spent the past 3 days in the hospital thinking about how she would defend her actions. But hearing the accusations read aloud made them seem more real, more serious. This wasn't a disciplinary hearing. This was a court-martial that could end with her in military prison. Captain Martinez was called as the first witness. He testified about Sarah's assignment to the squadron, her performance during her first months at Norfolk, and the events leading up to the search and rescue mission. His testimony was factual and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension in his voice. Captain Martinez, Admiral Hawthorne said when he had finished his prepared statement, "In your opinion, was Lieutenant Chin qualified to participate in this search and rescue mission?" Captain Martinez hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Admiral, Lieutenant Chin met all technical qualifications for the mission. She was current on her flight status, familiar with search and rescue procedures, and had demonstrated excellent performance in squadron operations. But this was her first operational flight with your squadron, correct?" "Yes, Admiral. Due to administrative requirements, she had not previously been assigned flight duties." Admiral Hawthorne's eyebrows rose slightly. "Administrative requirements?" Sarah could see Captain Martinez struggling with how to answer that question. The truth was that she had been kept from flying due to prejudice and politics, but saying that directly would implicate half the squadron's leadership in discrimination. Lieutenant Chun was initially assigned to administrative duties while she familiarized herself with squadron operations, he said carefully. "For 2.5 months?" Admiral Hawthorne's tone was neutral, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Yes, Admiral." Admiral Hawthorne made a note on the legal pad in front of her. "During this time, did Lieutenant Chun request flight assignments?" "She did, Admiral, on multiple occasions." "And were these requests denied?" Another pause. "They were deferred pending completion of her administrative orientation." Sarah could see where this line of questioning was going, and she wasn't sure whether to be hopeful or terrified. Admiral Hawthorne was clearly not buying the official explanation for why Sarah had been grounded for so long, but that didn't necessarily mean she was sympathetic to Sarah's cause. Lieutenant Commander Williams was called next. His testimony about the search and rescue mission was precise and damning. He described Sarah's unauthorized deviation from a search pattern, her refusal to follow direct orders, and her reckless decision to attempt a water landing without authorization. "Lieutenant Commander Williams," Admiral Hawthorne said when he finished, "in your opinion, could the rescue have been completed successfully without Lieutenant Chin's unauthorized actions?" "Admiral, Coast Guard rescue was en route and would have arrived within 20 minutes. The survivors could have been retrieved safely without endangering additional personnel or equipment. All 4 survivors." Williams hesitated. "Admiral, it's difficult to say with certainty. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly." "Lieutenant Commander, I've read the Coast Guard report. The man who went underwater was unconscious when Lieutenant Chun reached him. In your professional opinion, would he have survived another 20 minutes in those conditions?" Williams looked uncomfortable. "Admiral, I can't speculate about hypothetical scenarios." "It's not hypothetical, Lieutenant Commander. We have the medical reports. The man had been in the water for over 3 hours and was suffering from severe hypothermia. 20 more minutes would almost certainly have been fatal. Yes, Admiral. You're probably correct. Admiral Hawthorne made another note. So Lieutenant Chin's actions, while unauthorized and reckless, may have saved a life? Possibly, Admiral. But that doesn't justify violating direct orders and destroying a military aircraft. Noted. The hearing continued for the rest of the morning, with witness after witness testifying about Sarah's actions. Chief Rodriguez spoke about her dedication and competence. The Coast Guard rescue pilot testified about the conditions at the rescue site. The civilian survivors, still recovering from their ordeal, gave emotional testimony about Sarah's heroic actions. But the most surprising witness came just before the lunch recess. The panel calls Lieutenant James Morrison. Sarah watched in amazement as her former supervisor walked to the witness table. Morrison looked nervous and kept glancing around the room as if he was looking for an escape route. Lieutenant Morrison, Admiral Hawthorne began, you were Lieutenant Chin's immediate supervisor during her first months at Norfolk. Can you describe her assigned duties? Morrison cleared his throat. Admiral, Lieutenant Chun was assigned to administrative support functions, filing, inventory management, data entry, that sort of thing. And, in your opinion, were these duties appropriate for someone with Lieutenant Chin's qualifications and training? Morrison's eyes darted toward Captain Martinez, then back to Admiral Hawthorne. Admiral, I was told that Lieutenant Chun needed to familiarize herself with squadron operations before being assigned flight duties. Told by whom? By my chain of command, Admiral. I see. And during her time working under your supervision, did Lieutenant Chin ever express dissatisfaction with her assignments? She did ask about flight opportunities on several occasions. What did you tell her? Morrison was sweating now. I told her that flight assignments would be considered when appropriate. Admiral Hawthorne leaned forward slightly. Lieutenant Morrison, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a truthful answer. Was Lieutenant Chin kept from flight duties because of concerns about her qualifications, or for other reasons? The silence in the room was deafening. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Other reasons, Admiral. What reasons? Morrison glanced at Captain Martinez again, then seemed to make a decision. Admiral, there were concerns about squadron cohesion, about how the other pilots would react to having a female pilot in the unit. I see. And who expressed these concerns? The concerns came from multiple sources within the squadron leadership. Admiral Hawthorne made several notes, her expression giving nothing away. Thank you, Lieutenant Morrison. You're dismissed. The hearing recessed for lunch, but Sarah found that she had no appetite. She sat alone in the base cafeteria, picking at a sandwich and trying to process what she had just heard. Morrison's testimony had confirmed what she had suspected all along, that she had been discriminated against from the moment she arrived at Norfolk. But she wasn't sure whether that would help or hurt her case. When the hearing reconvened, Admiral Hawthorne called for closing arguments. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Sarah had violated direct orders, destroyed military property, and endangered her own life through reckless actions. The fact that her actions had ultimately saved lives didn't excuse the fundamental breach of military discipline. Sarah's defense counsel, a young lawyer from the Judge Advocate General's office, did his best to argue that the circumstances justified her actions. He pointed to the lives saved, the discrimination she had faced, and the time-critical nature of the rescue situation. But even to Sarah, the argument sounded weak. When the closing arguments were finished, Admiral Hawthorne dismissed everyone except Sarah. Lieutenant Chun, please remain seated. The room emptied quickly, leaving Sarah alone with the most powerful officer in the Atlantic Fleet. Admiral Hawthorne gathered her papers deliberately, then walked around the table to sit in the chair directly across from Sarah. Do you know why I came here personally for this hearing, Lieutenant? Sarah shook her head. No, I've admitted. Because 37 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. Different circumstances, same fundamental issue. Admiral Hawthorne's voice was quiet but intense. I was a young officer, convinced I could make a difference, certain I was being held back because I was a woman. And I was right. Sarah stared at her, not sure where this conversation was going. I made a choice, Admiral Hawthorne continued. I chose to follow orders, to keep my head down, to prove myself through patience and persistence. It took me 15 years to get my first meaningful command assignment. 15 years of watching less qualified men get promoted ahead of me because I was determined to play by the rules. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Lieutenant Shun, you were meant to die in that water 3 days ago. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Admiral, not literally, but the system was designed to kill your spirit, your ambition, your belief that you could make a difference. You were supposed to accept the administrative assignment, keep quiet about the discrimination, and eventually transfer out in frustration. That's what the system wanted. That's what many of the people in this squadron expected. Admiral Hawthorne stood and walked to the window, looking out the flight line where F divided by -18s were taking off and landing in routine training flights. But you didn't die, Lieutenant. You refused to accept defeat. When the moment came to choose between your career and your conscience, you chose your conscience. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of officer you are. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. Admiral, I know I violated orders. I know I destroyed valuable equipment. But those people would have died if I hadn't acted. Admiral Hawthorne turned back to face her. Yes, they would have. And that's exactly why you're the kind of pilot the Navy needs more of, not fewer of. She returned to her seat and pulled out a folder that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Lieutenant Shun, the charges against you are being dropped. Sarah blinked in confusion. Admiral, Captain Martinez has submitted a report recommending you for the Navy Cross for heroism. The Coast Guard has requested that you be assigned to their rescue training program as an instructor. And I am personally recommending you for immediate promotion to lieutenant commander and assignment as a flight leader. Sarah stared at her in disbelief. I don't understand. The system that tried to ground you is broken, Lieutenant. It's based on prejudice and fear rather than competence and courage. What you did out there proved that talent and dedication matter more than gender or politics. The Navy needs officers who will do the right thing even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it goes against orders. Admiral Hawthorne closed the folder and handed it to Sarah. You were meant to die, Lieutenant, but you chose to live instead. More importantly, you chose to let others live. That's the kind of decision that defines a true leader. 3 months later, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise, watching her squadron of F divided by -18s prepare for a training mission. As the squadron's new executive officer, she had worked hard to create an environment where every pilot was judged on merit rather than prejudice. The squadron was stronger now, more cohesive and effective than it had ever been. And every time Sarah climbed into the cockpit of her aircraft, she remembered Admiral Hawthorne's words. Some people are meant to die, meant to have their spirits broken, their dreams destroyed, their potential wasted. But the strongest among us refuse to accept that fate. They choose to live, to fight, to prove that courage and competence matter more than the opinions of those who would hold them back. Sarah had been meant to die. Instead, she had chosen to soar. And in doing so, she had changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The mockery had stopped. The discrimination had ended. And the next woman who walked into that hangar would find a very different reception than the one Sarah had received. That, more than any medal or promotion, was the victory that mattered most.